Welcome back to another episode. This is Ergonautic. We read books and papers so you don't have to. Today, we're going to discuss some interesting subgenres. We'll kind of introduce some vocabulary and some ideas. We're big believers in prior art and giving credit where credit is due. So to set it up, let's talk about these models of defensive and productive reasoning, Model 1, Model 2, and their origins, and then we'll kind of chop it up from there. So we'll let Jabe set it up.
Cool. So there's an entire kind of subset of systems thinking, systems theory that kind of centers around the Boston area. And Argyris and Shine are members of that kind of, what I generally think of as Boston systems thinking. And you can see Senge is also kind of from that area, from that same group of people. So these people are all kind of interacting with each other. Just as a side note, there's also like a very clear West Coast version of this. So like sometimes you get interesting interactions between different theories of what, like, for instance, lean is or system thinking is based on whether you're talking about people centered around like the University of Washington or more like the MIT.
Everyone's touching the same elephant.
Yep. I just kind of describe it a little bit different. One of the things that ends up happening in MIT because of Senge and Argyris and Shine is that there becomes kind of a more of a psychological view on what systems are. So it's kind of rhymes or makes sense with some of the stuff that we generally talk about when we talk about socio-technical systems.
They're leaning to the socio side.
That's right. So you might even call it like psycho-technical systems. In other words, like the way that psychological systems interact with technical systems, or you could call it psychosocial technical systems. Anyway,
it's definitely psycho at some point.
Yeah, it's definitely psycho. Totally crazy. Anyway, so one of the things that Argyris gets quite interested in is
so just real quick for the readers or the listeners at home, what did he write? And then like what could go like the stuff we're going to talk about today, where does it come from?
So Argyris is an academic, and he wrote a good amount of books about different forms of reasoning within organizations, how people think about things, how people make decisions inside of organizations, and tried to, while doing that, like interact with systems thinking at the same time, right? So they're all talking about learning organizations to some extent. And one of the primary things Argyris, who we'll talk about a lot today, is concerned about is like, how does reasoning allow or prevent learning at an organizational level? Like what happens there when people use reasoning? And
so the terminology, the theory of action, is that from Argyris?
That's from Argyris, yep. So Argyris in particular has different ideas about theories of action. And he basically says there's two big models in his mind.
Well, first, how would you define the theory of action before you get to the models?
Okay. So a theory of action basically means, does everybody generally have an idea what we would mean by like a theory of change? The theory of change means like, I think by doing X and Y, the outcome will be whatever. So I have a theory of what I'm doing in order to change something. And ideally, if you're doing a transformation, you have sets of theories of change that you've written down. In the common parlance that people use quite a lot nowadays, another example of that is what's called the Kellogg model, or if anybody's ever heard anybody ranting about outcomes over outputs, those are all what are called theories of change, right? Theories of actions are similar. It's a question of what is the theory informing the thing that I'm doing right now? Well, how did I come up with the idea to do this? And one of the ways to kind of think about that is, at least in psychology, there's a lot of questions about like, how do people overcome the tendency to not act and start acting? Because in a lot of cases, it's easier to just not do anything. And action takes effort and
or to just do the same thing, not change.
Yep, just repeat themselves. They don't have to understand much. And the theories of actions are a theory. A theory of action is a theory that informs why you're doing something, basically. So if someone comes up to you and says to you, "Hey, dude, why are you doing that?" and whatever you say there is a theory of action, right? And there's different kind of categories of those theories of action. This is one of the ways you can think about it. So like there's certain two buckets for our jurists, at least. There's model one and model two. And there's another way you can say that, which is there's defensive reasoning versus productive reasoning. And so for a jurist, one of the biggest kind of insights is that people don't always use rationality to make progress. Sometimes they use it simply to defend their own position. And this, like, if you think about it really quickly, in most organizations where, especially, so IT is a perfectly good example of this in a lot of cases, that are based on some sort of meritocracy, where your merit is that you're an expert of some form. So in other words, you retain your position in the hierarchy of people by being smart at something. You would defend that position by defending the rationality that you have exhibited to make it look like you're smart. In other words, you really, really avoid anyone having any questions about whether you're intelligent or you're smart or you know what you're doing. And so you use all your reasoning powers to defend the things that you've already said or already done. Yeah, that makes sense?
This is model one,
This
defensive
is
reasoning.
what's called model one or defensive reasoning. And he said the problem with this is that in organizations that do that, you end up in situations where people can't make any progress because they're, instead of using reasoning to understand what didn't work, they're using reasoning to explain what did work, right? And so, like, this is another kind of like subtle thing that is important to recognize. In a lot of cases, when you're doing like scientific work, you have to kind of have this idea that there's a difference between validation and invalidation, and you need to understand which one's more important. And in like a Popperian theory of science, you want to invalidate things. In other words, it's more important to know what doesn't work than it is to know what does work. And the reason is, if you know something doesn't work, you can stop doing it, right? If you
we're so not subscribing to it in the academic environment, right? Because we only publish what did work, and so we keep repeating the same experiments that don't work.
That is a major and significant part of the reproduction crisis that we have right now, and also a major source of waste that's well known inside the scientific community. You only publish success stuff. Where does the data go that proves that certain hypotheses don't work?
Most people spend years doing experiments that don't work, and nobody learns from the experiments that don't work, even though we profess learning from mistakes. I just spent, by the way, the last 10 minutes trying to share this because I figured it turns out that StreamYard didn't want to eat the file that I had, so I had to convert it to another file, whatever. This is potentially like a lot of words, but this is from Chris Argyris, and I call him Argyris because, you know, I don't know if that's like, it's probably not the correct pronunciation, but it's, you know, the words that you read stay in your head in the way you read them. But yeah, so I think we can kind of go through the terms, but like, it is opinion-based objectives where someone is driving to achieve the objective as the person defined it. And usually it's the person with the highest title or the highest authority in the room. And then maximize winning, minimize losing, not just necessarily for that person, but for everybody, right? So everybody's trying to make each other feel good. Therefore, once we set the objective, we must say that we achieved it. We must say that it worked, right? Like, there cannot be a failed DAO's transformation. There cannot be a failed any kind of initiative inside the organization. So we cook the spreadsheets to make it look like it wasn't failed, and then emphasize rationality, which is ironic here, right? But we want to cook the spreadsheets so that we can prove to people that we've been rational about making these choices, right? So it's not, you know, it's not that this person's opinion has been validated. It's, you know, we've all, you know, generated all this data to prove that the opinion was correct.
Yeah, and so the result of this in most organizations, so this is Model 1 is a classic example of like leadership bias, hippo development, and really what ends up happening in Argyris's mind is that the people who are using defensive reasoning, who also have any sort of power, work to control others, control the environment, control the processes, because what they basically argue is that the fault in whatever's causing the feedback loop to not close correctly is not my idea. It has to be in the environment. It has to be someone else's problem. It has to be that somebody didn't do it correctly. And so you get all of these kind of classic behaviors where, people start micromanaging, they start microscheduling, they start overprescribing, they start spending a lot of time poking at people and trying to figure out why they aren't doing what they were told to do, etc. And so you can think about this, in the what's the name of the model that we have, like generative and toxic, and the Westrom model. This is solidly the rationale that would be seen in the first of the third of the Westrom model.
Yeah, so right? The Western spectrum sets up generative, bureaucratic, and pathological cultures.
This is like very pathological and specific. Like in the Western model, they have like, you shoot the messenger, you silence people, things like that. That's all the types of behaviors you would expect in a system.
But also, correct me if I'm wrong,
deploying defensive reasoning.
But I think Argyris has run like a study trying to discover what most organizations use to reason, and the overwhelming majority of organizations use Model 1 reasoning. Absolutely. Right?
Yep.
So it is actually super prevalent. The other thing this always reminds me of, which I don't ever quote, because Jack Welch is kind of a controversial figure, but I went to an MBA school founded by Jack Welch, so I heard a lot of that kind of propaganda. And I think one of the things that he was always very passionate about is what he called radical candor. And so like this, like, instead of saving face all the time, you have to actually tell it like it is, because otherwise you're just perpetuating mistakes, and up and down in the organization, no one ever tells each other how it is. So if we made a wrong decision ever, we'll just continue making it forever.
Yep. So can you define face saving? Is one of my favorite ideas. Can you define it for people who haven't maybe heard of that theory before? It's a really interesting idea.
So if you have like a proper definition, I can define it in my own words, but sure, I don't know that,
Go for it. Good.
Okay.
Do your version. I'll do my version.
So my version of it is like it's the white lies syndrome, right? So like if you go to a dinner made by your mother-in-law, and it's awful, like you will never ever say this dinner is awful. Like this is completely unacceptable by all standards in the society that we live in. And it, like, there's a bunch of research on that too. Like children at 1 year old already understand that, like, whatever, you can't do these things. And so we are socialized to save face for other people and for ourselves. And we do this in organizations because we're socialized to do this in our personal lives. And so like the default mode of operation is for us to try to tell people that everything's fine, right? So if someone makes a mistake, or if project doesn't work, or if something doesn't achieve the results that we want, we try to minimize the messaging. Now, when you have a big organization, especially when the communication goes from down to up, from bottom up, like everybody minimizes the negativity until it gets to the top, and like there's no negativity left, right? So the person on the line, quote unquote, can be screaming like this isn't working, and the message the CEO gets is like, we have a little bit of a problem, but we're fixing it.
If you're lucky, you get that message. This is the watermelon reporting, where it's all red in the middle and green on the outside. The comment I wanted to make when you're there before Jabe gives his definition of face saving is that these kind of conventions of what face means, and then what implies what face saving would mean are highly cultural and contextual, right? So from one culture, what it would be face saving or about, losing face might be nothing and actually expected in some other culture.
Absolutely.
And as I recently acquired the favorite book to quote the weirdest people in the world, as he talks about, like some of these biases are cultural rather than genetic, like rather than, all humans behave a certain way, which pertains even to things like altruism and stuff like that, or sense of fairness, for instance. That was an interesting one. Like we all think that everybody has this sort of similar sense of fairness, but that's not true when you dig into some other cultures, and their fairness is perceived totally differently. So yes, the face saving here is also like, this is a big. I have not worked with Asian folks too much, but this is definitely something people say in the US, that in Asia, saving face is even more important. So no one ever tells you if there is a problem.
So for Argyris, I think he would generally agree with what you said, but the trick with Argyris to understand Model 1 and Model 2, face saving is a good part of understanding it. So basically what Argyris is trying to say with Model 1 is that the organization is collaborating on something. They're all collaborating on a thing. They're all trying to figure out how to produce something. It's not that they're not trying to collaborate on the truth. They're not trying to figure out what the truth of the system is. What they're collaborating on is minimizing negative feelings and maximizing the sense that people are winning. And so face saving for him is basically literally this thing where you go to somebody and there's this like tacit, unstated thing, which is, dude, like I won't tell anybody you're incompetent if you don't tell anybody I'm incompetent. So I won't tell anybody you screwed that up, but I expect in the future you won't tell anybody that I screwed my thing up. That's what you're collaborating on, is hiding the incompetence in the organization.
So
I think this makes it sound very, sorry, this makes it sound very intentional, and I don't think it is intentional. I think this is more of an instinct that we all have to like pat each other on the back. Like nobody likes to give criticism or receive criticism, therefore we minimize criticism. But if we're talking about organization achieving real world objectives, that sometimes works out really painfully for us.
So the question I want to pose in what I would consider pathological on the Western spectrum, and then kind of map it into this notion of defensive reasoning, is we're talking about minimizing negative feelings, and that's true to a certain extent inside of, I don't know what you want to call it, a bounded context or something, like a little cultural or maybe like sub mafia in an organization. But you definitely also see in these pathological organizations a blame culture, and maybe these other people didn't do their job, right? Like we did our job and we're going to protect our feelings inside of that context, but these other people didn't do their job. And you see this kind of battle, tug of war, political kingdom building play out. So how would you map that aspect of a pathological culture to the defensive reasoning Model 1 theory of action?
So in competitive groups where one group doesn't save the face of the other group, they're tacitly or explicitly violating the agreement, and so they go to war with each other, right? It's like, dude, you're not supposed to say that I'm incompetent. And if we could just get back to like everybody being nice to each other, we just won't talk about it at all. But if you're going to point out what I do wrong, I'm going to point out what you do. And it becomes so again, that's this in this list. It's the maximize winning, minimize losing. The subset of that is that in this model, the Model 1 theory, it is a zero-sum game. There's winners and losers. And so the minute that you don't play on the winning team, you're going to be on the losing team. And I'm going to make your team lose now, right? So because we can't collaborate on what's true, we're going to out each other as much as possible about whatever random stuff. And so you get in that pathological system, right, the way that we've been describing it, and you've probably both seen this in organizations plenty of times. just because they disagree about something, the disagreements tend to be expressed in politics, not in like actual factual things. People don't point at the thing that's wrong. They just say you're bad. Everything you're thinking about is wrong. You're thinking about it the wrong way, all that kind of stuff, right? And so you can't actually solve the problem. And in Model 2, the idea is that if you were to just put down the politics and start talking about what was factually happening, what was actually happening, and be more interested in the scientific outputs of the processes, then you could actually make progress, even if you didn't agree on things.
We should
So
define
I
Model 2.
I'm gonna find the slide maybe at some point. But I wanted to point out that you made an excellent point, which is like one of the main differences between Model 1 and Model 2 reasoning is that here we're trying to prove that something is correct. So like if you gather data and it disproves your hypothesis, in here you failed, even though that's not true. Like that's not the scientific method. Like you shouldn't be aiming to necessarily prove your original thinking. You should be aiming to learn, right?
But also, so like, again, we could, use the Ono quote for this. The biggest problem is no problem. Any experiment that you do that absolutely proves your hypothesis was 100% correct means that you've missed something, right? Because in all scientific theory, we're only progressing towards the truth. We never actually arrive, right? So if you believe you find some final truth in most systems, it means you're missing something. You're missing a variable. You don't understand something, right? And so that's again, the Popperian version of that is the value of falsification is much higher than the value of
one negative example disproves the rule, but no matter how many positive examples you find, it doesn't prove it.
That's exactly. All positive examples are only equivocations. They're close to being the real thing. They aren't the real thing. Sorry.
Let's define the Model 2 and kind of compare and contrast, and then we'll get back to this.
So Model 2, or productive reasoning, right, centers the organization on valuing conversations about what's objectively happening as opposed to what's emotionally or opinionatedly happening, right? It really focuses on the idea that everyone in the organization has a responsibility for contributing to the understanding of how the system is in relationship to whatever problems that you're trying to solve. And so in that case, instead of having this idea that, to use the language everybody uses these days, that the hippo says this is the right thing, this is what we should do. Instead, in an organization like that, free and informed choice would mean when we're making a decision, there's a conversation about why are we going to do this? And everyone gets to basically get on board or object, right? They don't have to do the thing. They actually have to come up with a plan together, manage that plan together. And the theory there is that because they're working together and that there's no one person who's going to is going to be right or wrong, people are more likely to point out, hey, this isn't working, or hey, look at what's really happening here. And the result of that is instead of trying to say, the other kind of version of Model 1 is, I know what's right. In Model 2, it's more like, what have we learned? The value is based on what did we learn, right? And so I've often tried to say, like, I think learning inside of a scientific method is the delta between expectation and outcome. If you don't know what your expectations were, and if you're not allowed to compare the expectation to the actual outcome, you're in Model 1 thinking. If you have written down and clarified what your expectations are before doing a thing, and then you compare the outcome to the actual expectation, you're in Model 2. You're trying to understand, and you're trying to learn, and you're trying to change the organization's ability to observe what's really happening and have active, productive discussions about those things. Make sense?
I think that one of the things that happens all the time is not writing down your expectations. That's so endemic. I don't know, like, and I'm very guilty of it myself. Like when I make a decision, I'm very bad at being like, here's why I made this decision, and here's what I'm trying to learn or accomplish. And
Yep.
it's very easy if you're ever stock trading, the first thing they tell you is when you trade a stock, when you buy or sell a stock, write it down and write down why you did it. Because it's really, really easy to retroactively then go back and be like, oh, I predicted that, Bitcoin's gonna go down or up or whatever, and like just explain it all away. Whereas your initial reasoning was something completely different. And the only way to learn if you made a mistake, like if you're getting better or if you're making mistakes, is to actually document what you were thinking at the time.
And I think the last thing there was the key, and this is where you get from like single loop learning to double loop learning, right? So in single loop learning, you can only determine whether what happened did what you expected it to happen. And as you just kind of stated, the trick in double loop learning is allowing the reasoning itself to be questioned. The reasoning behind how you came up with the decision. In other words, model 1 doesn't allow you to examine the theory of action itself, whereas model 2 allows you to explore the theory of action, the reasoning behind what you did, by making it explicit and not implicit. And so there's a trick here that Argyris and Shine both talk about that's kind of interesting to think through. And the argument ends up being that in a lot of startups, or if you have an innovation team or a creative team, or a team that does new novel things, in those situations, it tends to be true that model 1 thinking is more productive because you just have to get people to do stuff that's weird and out of their normal way, right? And so you tend to have a small group of people who make a lot of decisions, and then people have to follow them into the wilderness and hope that things turn out. And so a lot of startups look like this. This is kind of like the classic example of you have the startup founder who's a genius, and everybody's not quite sure how they made the decisions that they made. They don't understand the crazy reasoning that got that innovator to make those decisions. They're just creative and special, blah, blah, blah. And there you go. You're off to the races of having an organization that believes that it's not a good idea to question the founder, because the founder has never made it explicit how he or she reasons, and therefore, but it worked because the startup is being successful. So don't question it, just do it. And you
I
have an anecdote about Pivotal that you're not gonna like.
we don't talk about the dead. Don't talk ill of the dead. So if you think about the mental model of an org chart and the discussions we've had about lamination and disintegration across and up and down in the hierarchy, do we think, or does Argyris think, that you can have different parts of the organization in different models? And then I'm really curious what you would advocate, right? So like, if we're just purely academic and observing these characteristics and categorizing an organization, that's one thing. But what does this theory of action, model 1, model 2, give as a tool for anyone to improve or take some quote unquote action?
Sure. So I think if we were to restate some of these things in socio-technical systems theory, one of the things about model 2 is its form of research is what's called action research. It is getting everybody on the team to be doing research together, right? And you can see this same type of thinking in things like the Toyota Kata and in lean theory in general, where the idea is to turn everybody in the organization into a scientific thinker, or to use scientific thinking, although very rarely would they actually say that explicitly. But that's clearly some of the subtext. They want people to think critically by creating evidence and creating hypotheses and evidence to defend their positions on how to improve things, right? So the trick is, I think, in complex systems and kind of the things that we see nowadays. So, this stuff is written 30 years ago. This model 2 thinking probably works really well in relatively moderate levels of change systems, right? Like, so that basically you have to imagine that theory 1 suppresses a lot of information in the organization. So it suppresses the flow of information. That's what it's doing, right? Theory 2, in theory, is producing a lot of information. So there's just at some point at which an organization in a high change environment or a large enough organization, it's theory 2 would produce too much information, right? So this is kind of the classic stuff from Herbert Simon and other people about the nature of componentization and why teams exist. So teams exist partially to summarize information as input into other teams, right? That's why they exist at all. Like, otherwise, all the information would have to go everywhere through the organization at all times. So instead, what I think we would tend to talk about at Ergonautic would be how do you understand the flow of information through the system, and where things are being summarized and where things aren't being summarized, so that you maximize things like the qualities of Model 2 behavior, the ability to, at least inside of a local system, examine the system carefully, be clear about it, produce information about it, have discussions about what's actually happening, while avoiding the negatives of Model 1, self-sealing statements, blah, 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 while also trying to retain some of the value of the Model 1 thing, which the Model 1 values would be the ability to hide information when it's not necessary for actually making decisions, things like that.
So the thoughts that came when you were discussing that is, I immediately want to talk about Cynefin and these different domains, because model 1 has to work to some degree, or it wouldn't be the predominant model.
Absolutely.
And then trying to make the question I was asking earlier a little more concrete. Is it conceivable that you have these kind of like Model 1 in the lower parts of the organization, and then at the top there is some Model 2, right? That you're navigating at the leadership executive level, you're navigating it, but then you kind of,
I think just
whatever,
even in a single team, right? Like you can have a sub team somewhere in the organization that uses productive reasoning because they have a productive manager or a productive number of people that learn to collaborate and whatever.
Exactly.
And also,
that's like the same example
companies are constantly in flux in terms of who works there and what they work on. So that this stuff can change pretty drastically. But I also we kind of we touched on this and didn't talk about it, but I want to talk about this a little bit more. I think people are a little more familiar with the concept of single loop and double loop learning, but it doesn't come up all that much. I think the interesting thing that you just said, Andrew, was that Model 1 has to work. Otherwise, people would the 80% of companies using Model 1 would be broke, right? So the same reasoning. Single loop works until it doesn't, right? This is why companies make a lot of money using single loop learning until they don't, right? And anyway. So
that's
just kind
why
of
Cynefin's interesting, right? Because Cynefin talks about these domains where if you have a simple domain, then your model works and you just win. But if the game changes and you get into these more complicated, more complex, or chaotic domains, then you need to do something different, and you're not able to change because you're stuck on that model.
So how about we
it's
talk
not
about
just that you're stuck on the model. You're told by the system to not examine the information. Just do. Don't think. That's kind of like what happens in a simple system, right?
So
ironically, at all levels of it, right? Even the biggest boss is still functioning by the same pattern.
100%. Yep, absolutely. So that, in our Argyris' language, and in the language of a lot of psychologists and sociologists and things like that, the problem with single loop learning, the problem with Model 1 is that it creates a brittle system. So, to use the anti-fragile stuff, it creates a fragile system. It creates a system that does not have resilience. And in particular, the reason why it doesn't have resilience is because it works until it catastrophically does not work. And then the problem is that you don't notice that the drift is occurring underneath you. There's lots of signs, like weak signals that the system's starting to fail. But because the system, the theory of action, the rationality that drives the system is based on don't point out negatives as long as the outcome works. It accumulates. So, you get, again, safety 2 theory around things like how drift occurs. That is this theory 1, Model 1 or single loop learning is a good example of that. Cynefins simple domain collapsing into chaotic domain is another example. Same sets of theories are involved there. And it makes, for our Argyris, it makes the individuals themselves in the organizations quite brittle, because they basically, as individuals, have never had real experiences with failure. They don't know how to fail well. They don't know how to fail well, right? They don't understand that it's better to admit small failures and try to correct small failures than it is to wait until like the entire place is on fire, right?
But in some cultures, you get punished for that, for the
That's
small
exactly
failures.
right. Exactly. And again, so you have to have this differentiation. Am I being punished for telling the truth, or am I being punished for not saving someone else's face? And so how do we differentiate those things so that, this gets a little bit into the common ground conversations we had before about, like, it's really, really critical if you want organizations to work together successfully with multiple teams doing Model 2 behaviors within their own local contexts, that there's not an assumption that there's a single rationality that dominates the entire organization. That's really ends up being critical to understand. And so that's the problem with Model 1 to some extent, is it basically says there only has to be one rationality. There is one way of thinking about this problem, and it should be true across the entire organization. And we're going to stomp out any attempts to think about this problem in a different way that might point out that the first way is not complete or something like that.
Sasha, you want to share?
Ends up being this ability for organizations to look at different parts of the organization and say, I wouldn't have done it that way, but I don't think that the way that they're doing it is completely irrational. It seems like they're doing it in a reasonable way, and that's their stuff and my stuff. And as long as it meshes together at the end of the day, I shouldn't be like interfering with their way of working, right? And that is a Model 2 approach to having a diversity of thought inside the organization, where what is being examined and questioned is different forms of rationality, not in order to determine which rationality should dominate, but in order to determine whether or not the rationality is productive for doing what it is intended to be doing in the organization.
For the flow of work through the system. Sasha, you want to share this quote? And then it seemed like you wanted to say something about the double loop, single loop stuff.
Yeah, so the quote is again, this ends up being a very arduous oriented discussion, right? Even though he's not the only person who worked on related theories, as you said. But he has a paper called Teaching Smart People How to Learn. And honestly, to me, when you read the paper, it's basically the same words as Carol Dweck growth mindset, right? And it like talks about how people are so invested in saving face that they can't learn, they can't fail, they can't, be vulnerable, which is always required for learning. And as you said, Andrew, I think in some cultures, that is how you have to be, right? So like if you've been socialized to think that mistakes are bad, and it could be by, your entire culture or your family or your particular organization or whatever, you are saving face all the time. And the interesting part about what Arjus points out here is that it's particularly prevalent in smart people. So that the smarter and more accomplished the person is, the more likely they are to exercise defensive reasoning the moment they fail. Like, I know this on my own skin. Like, it's really difficult, and it was happening a lot when I was younger. But like, I would expect myself to excel at anything I touch immediately. So not just excel at things, but like, I just went bowling for the first time. I must be good at bowling in 3 hours. Like, absolutely unreasonable kind of thing, but it was in my head that I just have to be good at everything or else, right? And when you have a person who's been largely successful throughout much of their life, they basically are never socialized to fail and deal with failure. So they have to succeed, or else they just fall apart. And exercise the defensive reasoning, which means blaming it on external circumstances, or trying to otherwise get out of being blamed for being from making mistakes.
We should read the quotes for people who don't have the
Sure.
benefit
Smart
of the
people don't learn because they have too much invested in proving what they already know and avoiding being seen as not knowing. But I think we talked about it a little bit on the previous podcast dedicated to learning. I think when I talk about learning, I always start with the person, not the organization, because the organization cannot learn if the majority of individuals in the organization are not capable of learning, or if the culture is set up in such way that learning is discouraged, structurally, right? Like, you can go to, as you can have a learning budget, and you can go to classes, and you can, like, how do I say this? Like, when we talk about learning, it isn't the academic credentials that matter. Like, we were briefly talking about this yesterday, and you said something about PhDs, and in my head, like, just that you have a PhD doesn't mean you're good at learning. Actually, like, you might, or it might not, right? And no offense to PhDs, but like,
some of my
to me,
best friends
learning,
are PhDs. Just kidding. Keep going.
mine too. um, I just, at one point I said I would never do it to myself, and I'm still holding. But like, to me, learning isn't about getting academic credentials, which is sort of an easier route, right? It's about succeeding at something new and meaningful over time.
I would say that credential should never be confused with capability. But also, I want to kind of go back to one thing you just said that's a little bit of a trigger for me, which is I believe individuals are always personally capable of learning. That's a very strong belief that I have. I think that it's a question of the stimulus and incentives that make it so. So it's the organizational, we'll call it, it's the habitat that makes the learning easier or more difficult. But then in a different habitat with the right stimulus and incentives, you'll get very different outcomes from the individuals and the organization, obviously.
Yep.
So this is another quote from the paper, Andrew, you like, about Marsick and Watkins. But no organizational learning can take place without individual learning and learning from the developments in the environment. The organization has the power to encourage or discourage individual learning, and to learn from or to ignore developments in the environment, right? So it's the setup, it's the structure that tells you if individuals are going to be able to learn. Now, I will say from personal experience, managers don't like to hear that, right? Because when managers hear this, they largely think that it places responsibility on them to somehow make their people learn. And I think they also think about it a lot of times in the sense of making people learn, right? So, like, how do I send them on LinkedIn Learning to complete this learning course or something like that? And I think, ideally you want to talk about empowerment and, again, psychological safety and things like that. I think I agree with you completely that humans want to learn and are fully capable of learning. And like what you want is to give them an environment in which they can succeed at doing so.
Absolutely.
So like I think there's like a I think you guys will both you two will both kind of have seen this type of thing happening inside an organization. So like you can imagine you got a bunch of developers who are valued for being really smart at developing things, and some chucklehead comes along, some chucklehead consultant comes along and tells them, oh, the way that you deploy software is not right. What you should be doing is using containers and a container scheduler and Kubernetes and blah blah blah. And the developers are
Gen
like,
AI, you should be using Gen AI.
yeah, I don't really care anything about any of that stuff. It's not what I'm smart about at. I don't want to know any of that. And so then a consultant goes over to the ops team and says, you're closer to the deployment part of this, so you should learn this stuff. And they put it together, and then they go back to the developers and they say to the developers, hey, you've got to use these things now. And no one ever stops and slows down and explains to the developer the rationale, the reasoning behind why it would be valuable for the developers, not for the organization, but for the developers themselves to use containers or to use Kubernetes. And so you're basically putting the developers in a position where they're going to deploy defensive reasoning. They're going to say, I'm not going to spend my time doing that. I'm going to talk to my product owner about why that's a waste of my time. That's all operations problems. That has nothing to do with me. I don't do that stuff. And the value of that is that I never have to fail at doing it. I don't have to show people that I don't understand it. Not just that, but I probably spent the last 20 years of my career telling people that operators are idiots and don't know what they're doing. So I would never lower myself to doing the work of operators anyway, blah, blah, blah. And you just get a loop that is this defensive reasoning loop, right? It's exactly the type of stuff we see. And it's basically what Argyris is trying to describe.
So feeding off of that thread, to me, the thing that I fell in love with from the three economies discussion is getting everyone to realize, or the opportunity to get people to realize the alignment of their selfish interests with the collective interest. So it's not, you're never going to get very far if you tell people they have to do something because they have to do something, if you can't connect their selfish interest to doing that.
That's right. And you can't convince them to follow your reasoning about why it's good. You have to understand their reasoning and explain it to them in their rationale in order to get them to understand it. They're not going to adopt your rationale just because it's your rationale. You have to explain to them in their own terms, in their own ways of thinking. And so it takes time often when you're going across different boundaries to sit down with someone and say, like, explain to me why you have this, why this is a problem to you. Do you understand this and that? Okay, so let me help you then. I'm going to explain the value of containers to a developer, not to the organization.
So since you put the Watkins and Mersick quote on the thing, I personally feel like the Model 1, Model 2 is somewhat reductive version of the dimensions of organizational learning to kind of like make this simplified model and compare and contrast things. We had other discussions and maybe express frustrations about what it takes to make 7 dimensions of organizational learning actionable. And so I'm going to go back to a question that I asked kind of earlier, and then I distracted all of us because I asked 2 questions at one time. But from the Argus perspective, Model 1, Model 2, is there some advocacy or what is actionable for someone who's kind of got these ideas and been introduced to, so you can recognize, oh, this is defensive learning and this is productive learning, but then what can we do to make defensive more productive?
So, for Argyris definitely is trying to convince people to use Model 2 as much as possible. I kind of complicated it by talking about complexity theory and trying to say, like, I think it's a systems theory that's a little bit older. There are people who would argue things like there's not only second not only double loop, but triple loop learning. And then there's people that would argue that the loop learning theories are outdated themselves. So put those objections that I had to the side for 2 seconds. Argyris basically would argue to help people to focus on reasoning as opposed to focusing on outcomes. In other words, how did we get where we are in our thought processes as opposed to how did we get where we are by following a process? So the really simple kind of way of saying that is like, you could look at the processes and procedures in your organization like a machine, and you're kind of going in there and tweaking the processes and procedures and like, tightening them up and figuring out the flow. And maybe you eliminate a process because you don't think it's necessary anymore and you re-engineer the flow and stuff like that. For Argyris, that's pretty much all still model one thinking. Anybody who kind of did an original cloud transformation experience probably experienced just they imported all the old rules and all the old procedures into the cloud arena. And so you're like, hey, we're not getting half the benefits we should have gotten out of going to the cloud because we still have to do all these crazy processes and procedures in order to access things, right? That's an example of process reengineering using Model 1. In Argyris's mind, what would be more important would be to question the reasoning behind each of the procedures and processes that you use, and not just as an external person, but with the people who are doing the work themselves. So it's a joint action, research-based research project focused on understanding the rationale and reasoning behind the processes that the organization uses in order to improve those processes, but also to allow the organization itself to kind of understand why the processes exist in the first place. And usually the way I try to explain that is if you don't understand the rationale behind the process, you probably don't have a stopping theory, right? You probably don't know what's too good of a job. And you probably also don't know what's not quite good enough of a job, because you don't have a way to like look at the outcome in relationship to the reason why you're producing the outcome. And the result of that is that people add more and more and more controls onto the outputs and the outcomes without ever explaining the rationale. They just add more controls, and that all makes it more expensive.
On the topic of action and being actionable, and this from personal experience and observation, do you think it's fair to say to someone who is in a largely Model 1 type of organization that they can shift to Model 2 unilaterally, particularly if they're in the middle to the bottom of that organization?
So first of all, like I put this quote on because I'm like, this is one of my favorite quotes, and it's, if knowledge was all it took, we'd all have six-pack abs, right? We all know how to achieve six-pack abs. Now, maybe not everyone wants a six-pack abs, but we all know how to be physically fit, right? But we don't all do it, and it's largely accessible to a lot of people who still don't do it, right? Because we don't practice what we want to embody, right?
We don't practice what we
teach. One of the things that Argyris makes a point of is the fact that you have to practice productive reasoning. So like, you can't just walk into your room and explain to people that they're using defensive reasoning and then be like, cool, you understood that, you all nodded, you all were in agreement, see you in 6 months when you're doing productive reasoning all the time, right? It is a process that takes some time, and it takes some basically facilitated learning, ability to lead discussions in a certain way, to teach people to use productive reasoning and to teach them that it's safe to use productive reasoning. So I'm very big on the fact that EQ skills require practice. So any such things we talk about,
you can't just teach them it's safe, because it's actually not safe, right? Because then you go and you say you're defensive, and we need to get to this hypothesis, and then there'll be a tombstone, and it'll be like, this was the messenger.
Exactly. And so like Argyris is pretty explicit about this. And one of the things he says is that unless power centers, so managers, executives, understand the ideas behind Model 2, if the upper part of the organization is Model 1, Model 2 behavior below will only be punished, right? Assuming that the rationale that the Model 2 people are exploring arrives in the Model 1 area. And it's simple, right? It's the thing we already talked about. In Model 1, there's one rationality and it's right. Why are you bringing me different ways of thinking? You weren't asked to do that. Stop doing it. Do it the way I told you to do it. Whereas in an organization where executives and managers understand the value of Model 2 thinking, they understand the true ideas and values behind diversity of thought and diversity of perspective, those people would encourage the idea that it's important not just to think differently, but to have different views and to actively work to integrate those views into an entire system. That's not just like, you're not just looking for a bunch of people to be like, oh, I think differently than everybody, aren't I a special snowflake? No. You're looking for people that have different insights, different rationality, and then work with the organization to integrate those new insights and rationalities into the organization as a whole. It's not, you don't need a bunch of heretics. It's great to have heretics, but you don't need a bunch of them.
I want to be a little bit more optimistic. And I think as a middle manager, or even as an individual contributor, but mostly as a middle manager, you can create an environment for Model 2 for productive reasoning in the area that you control, in the area that you work at. As an individual contributor, you can convince your immediate team or your immediate manager that productive reasoning is superior to defensive reasoning. However, you would have to manage up differently, right? Like if your leadership is using Model 1, then you have to manage like the portrayal of results differently, right? But you can have psychological safety in your team and reason productively in your team as much as possible, which is why sometimes people work in pathological organizations for a good manager and have a great experience until that manager leaves the organization, right? Like this definitely is something that probably all of us have experienced. Let me see if I can have a really nice
the game theory of what we're just saying is each manager is effectively making a game for everyone under them to play. And if that game's fun and good and you're winning, then you keep playing. If the game's not fun or you're not winning, you don't want to.
Again, it's of course much better when your leadership is reasoning productively, right? The higher up in the organization the productive reasoning goes, the better for everyone. But I'm just saying, like, optimistically speaking, you could create pockets of productive reasoning. And if like literally if it's completely impossible, I know like the tech environment is not great out there, but like I would not want to find myself in an organization where you completely cannot do anything to reason productively.
Yeah, and so I think like one of the things I'd say, one of the things that we like to talk about a lot at Ergonautic with clients is the idea of coalition building. And coalition building is an example of trying to expand the domain in which productive reasoning can occur. And there's two advantages to so there's in silo or in team, we're going to make productive reasoning occur within a small group of people or within a silo. And that's certainly advantageous and not bad. But if you try to do coalition building across silos, across teams, etc., where it's natural that the reasoning is different. So the reasoning and rationale for operations teams tends to be different than the reasoning and rationale behind platform teams, between reasoning and rationale of development teams. So you naturally have this, when you coalition building, you naturally have this built-in activity or built-in requirement for a new kind of learning that happens in the organization. As you build the coalition, you are also building the opportunity for people to practice looking at other forms of rationality and building common ground across those things without insisting on collapsing the rationality into a single way of thinking. And that, I think, is a huge advantage for organizations that can do it. And so that's partially about saying, when you're trying to develop or change the system, it's often not just one leader, but maybe a series of leaders working together across different parts of the organization, creating a coalition and really valuing learning how to work together at multiple levels across multiple ways of thinking about multiple different kinds of problems. And that alone is a huge challenge. But that I think is more transformative for most organizations than any other way of working that they've had. I mean, and including things like agile or lean or theory of constraints or any of these things, which all tend to claim that there's a dominant right way of thinking about things, as opposed to saying, no, the value is in diversity of thought and diversity of observation and being able to integrate those things without
must follow the ritual or else. So we're coming up on time, so I want to introduce the last quote of this podcast, and it is an original by Jay Bloom. I should correct this slide to say Dr. Jay Bloom. What does it mean for an organization to learn? The learning is embedded in the organizational network in the same way the human learning is embedded in the connections between neurons.
When Jabe said this, it kind of made my mind go because, looking at the way the reinforcement learning, neural network, transformer stuff is evolving, and thinking about how those things reconfigure with more data, why aren't we able to take advantage of that in our organizations, right? We kind of lay down these organizational connections, communication workflows, and then we never really revisit them with the new data. Like, we're constantly getting new organizational data, but we're not learning with our organization the same way that we're going and buying GPUs and trying to get another however many trillion parameters into the model.
Yep. And it's all about, again, it's about that coalition building, connections. The value in the organization is in its connections, not in the individuals. It's intelligence isn't in the neurons, right? Intelligence isn't in any one of your people. It's in the groups of people.
I think it goes back to this comment I made earlier about the stimulus and the incentives, right? Like, each of those neurons is going to be having some input and some output. And then there's whatever utility function, reward, game theory version of it you want to say. If you just drew the org chart, like, a lot of organizations have the same basic org chart, but they're not all connected in this kind of communication feedback loop manner with the way their work flows through those same organizations, or the same, and topologically the same.
And it's one of the things that pertinent to the times is how layoffs sever these connections too, because these are connections between the neurons that are built that allow the organization to function effectively, and then you prune some of them, and you just essentially have to start learning the process from the beginning.
Absolutely.
Neurogenesis.
Again, like my thing that I've talked to a couple of people about recently is with layoffs. Now you get to find out if your organization's resilient or not, because you've pruned through a system that will either recover those connections or not. And so having organizations focusing on maximizing resilience, understanding how to implement and exercise resilience in order to come to a new stable system seems to be critical for a lot of organizations right now.
We're getting dangerously close to a new episode, but I think when you go to this resilience model, that one of the things that is confusing, and then the way that gets reflected in the stock market, is the time gap between the cause and effect, right? So if you did whatever today, then on the next quarter, it looks like you reduced a bunch of costs, but you're not necessarily modeling the long-term capability of the organization effectively. At least that's my story, and I'm going to stick to it.
Well, I think the problem right now that we have is in some cases it takes 20 years to catch up to you, right? And by then we're telling different stories and different people are being blamed for it in different circumstances.
Again, I think this is almost another episode, but we just read this article, and we had this conversation about the MBA CEOs versus the engineering CEOs and the decisions that were made at places like Boeing, and you could go through the list, Sony, Intel, whatever, and how by severing this connection to the engineering reality and just focusing on the finances, you got this great financial performance for a period, but now you have airplanes falling out of the air.
Yep.
So with that, I think we should get back to work and regularly scheduled program.
We will be in New York soon, first week of October. If you want to come hang out with us and talk about learning stuff, we'll be there at DevOpsCon. We're running a workshop there, but we'll also be happy to come hang out with people just in New York. So reach out if you're in New York and you'll be there on the first week of October. We'd love to hang out with people.
If anyone made it this far, I'll be in New York. I'll also be in Tampa Bay on the 19th for DevOps Days Tampa Bay. And then DevOps Days Dallas is right after New York on the 9th and 10th of October.
Since we're making an announcement, I will be in Antwerp, Belgium for DevOps Days.
DevOps Days, yes.
Yep, DevOps Days tour.
Well, with that, back to work. Back to Model 1.